Assalamualaikum. My name is Nur Atira Binti. Today, we will be presenting our chemical health risk assessment conduct at the Food Instrumentation Laboratory. Before I begin, I would like to introduce our group member. Firstly, we got Nurin Farhana. Second, Ayuni Hasana, and me, Nur Atira Binti Alias, Khadijah Izzati Binti Maliki, Aliana Juma, Wafa Aldina, and lastly, Siti Rauda Hasibun. For my part, I will be presenting the introduction of the workplace, the general objective, the specific objective, and the scope of the assessment. Our assessment was conducted at Food Instrumentation Laboratory, located at Block A, Level 2, Room A203, Faculty of Applied Science, University Technology Mara Shah Alam. The assessment was carried out on 9 May 2026, and the person in charge of the laboratory was Wan Nur Azlin Baharudin, who also served as our contact person throughout the assessment. This laboratory is mainly used for the food analysis, research, and also teaching activities. Laboratory personnel are responsible for preparing reagent, handling chemicals, supporting experimental work, and carrying out routinely laboratory operations. Since this activity involved the use of various hazardous chemicals, conducting a chemical health risk assessment is important to ensure a safe and healthy working environment. The general objective of this assessment was to evaluate the chemical health risk associated with the hazardous chemical used in the laboratory. These include identifying the hazard, assessing workers' exposure, and determine whether the existing countermeasures are sufficient to protect laboratory personnel. The specific objective for our assessment aim is to identify the hazardous chemical used during the laboratory activity, assess the workers' exposure, evaluate the effectiveness of the existing countermeasure, and recommend improvement to further reduce chemical health risk. Lastly, the scope of our assessment focused on the laboratory assistant who routinely handle hazardous chemical. The assessment covered chemical preparation, handling, storage, and also disposal involving 20 chemical hazards to health. We evaluate the possible route of exposure, including inhalation, skin contact, eye contact, and accidental ingestion. In addition, we review the existing control measure and identify recommendations to improve our workplace safety.
Now, I will explain the work site description for our chemical health risk assessment. The assessment conducted at the Food Instrumentation Laboratory, located in Block A, Level 2, Room A203, Faculty of Applied Science in UiTM Shah Alam. The main purpose of this laboratory is to support research, teaching, and food analysis. Student and laboratory personnel carry out practical experiment and analytical testing in the laboratory. The laboratory is equipped with several important facilities, including 2 chemical film hood, analytical balance, and laboratory bench. These facilities help ensure that chemicals are handled safely and accurately during laboratory. The main activities carried out include the storage handling, preparation of biological media, the preparation of reagent, work for test solvent, food instrumentation, and testing procedure. These activities involve the use of various hazardous chemicals, making chemicals risk assessment essential.
Next, I will explain the work that was assessed in this study. The work unit assessed is the laboratory personnel, specifically the laboratory assistant working in the Food Instrumentation Laboratory. Currently, there is 1 female lab assistant responsible for carrying out the daily laboratory activities. Similar exposure group, or SEG, consists of workers who perform similar tasks and are exposed to the same 20 hazardous chemicals within the same work area. Since their exposure patterns are similar, they can be assessed as one exposure group. The main responsibilities of the laboratory assistant include preparing chemical reagents, providing support during laboratory experiments, and managing daily laboratory operations such as chemical handling, equipment preparation, and maintaining a safe working environment. This routine task may expose the laboratory assistant to hazardous chemicals, especially through inhalation and skin contact, which is why a chemical health risk assessment is necessary.
I will explain our assessment methodology. This assessment follows the Chemical Health Risk Assessment or CHRA process. Step 1 is to gather information. We collected information about the laboratory, the chemical use, the work activities, and safety data sheet, or we call as SDS. Step 2 is to divide the workplace into work units. For our assessment, the work unit is the Food Instrumentation Laboratory. Step 3 is to determine the degree of hazard for each chemical. We identified hazardous chemicals and their health effects through inhalation, skin contact, and ingestion. Step 4 is to evaluate workers' exposure. We assess all possible routes of exposure, including inhalation, dermal contact, and accidental ingestion, while considering the frequency and duration of exposure. Step 5 is to determine the level of risk by combining the hazard level and exposure level. Step 6 is to assess whether the existing control measures are adequate, such as ventilation system, PPE, and safe work practice. Step 7 is to conclude the assessment based on the overall findings. Step 8 is to identify the actions that should be taken to reduce chemical risk. Step 9 is to recommend improvements and assign action priorities. Finally, Step 10 is to prepare and submit the complete assessment report. Now, I will explain Form A, which describes the work unit that was assessed. The assessment was conducted at the Food Instrumentation Laboratory on 16 May 2026. The laboratory operates from 8 a.m. until 5 p.m. under a normal working schedule, with one female worker involved during the assessment. Based on the workers' feedback, there have been no serious health complaints so far. However, the worker experienced discomfort due to frequent exposure to strong chemical odor. There is also a possibility of abnormal exposure because almost 100 different chemicals are used in the laboratory and workers may be exposed throughout their working hours. The laboratory also involved the simultaneous use of multiple chemicals, which increase the possibility of mixed chemical exposure. Although ingestion is unlikely because eating and drinking are prohibited inside the laboratory, good personal hygiene must always be maintained. Some additional findings include both fume hoods being fully occupied during operations, the absence of a chemical storage cabinet, limited chemical handling training, continuous chemical exposure during work, and only one of the 2 emergency exit doors being usable. These findings show that improvements are needed to enhance chemical safety in the laboratory.
Let's break down to the most critical hazardous ingredients on our list one by one to show how this parameter determine our final hazard rating HR on a scale 1 to 5. First, methanol. It is handled in a volatile liquid form. Its hazard classification is flammable liquid and acute toxicity. It carries code H225 for high flammability alongside H301, H311, and H331, meaning it is toxic if swallowed, inhaled, or in contact with skin. This assigns it the maximum hazard rating of 5, HR5. Second, Folin Chioculture, phenyl. That reagent, also a liquid, classified under skin corrosion. It carries H314, indicating it causes severe skin burns and eye damage, earning an HR5. Third, potassium hydroxide pellets. Unlike the first two, this is a solid pellet. However, because its classification is skin corrosion category 1 with code H314, it also triggers a maximum rating of HR5. Fourth, potassium dichromate. This solid carries severe chronic classifications like carcinogenicity, category 1B, and germ cell mutagenicity, with codes like H340 for genetic defects and H350 for causing cancer. It is rated as a severe HR4. To conclude our analysis of Form B1, let's look at the numerical breakdowns of our 20 chemicals. We have 3 chemicals that falls into the highest risk category of HR, which is methanol, Folin, and potassium hydroxide. We have 1 chemical that falls into the chronic risk category of HR4, which is potassium dichromate. The remaining 16 chemicals, which includes everyday laboratory substances like glucose, fructose, and nutrient agar, are designated as not classified or carry low hazard ratings, meaning they pose no significant danger under normal handling conditions. Finally, Form B1 maps out the routes of exposure, confirming whether these ingredients presents an active risk via dermal contact or accidental ingestion during lab preparation, ensuring our PPE choice match the physical reality of the hazard. Now, let's contrast our raw chemical inventory with Form B2, which shifts our focus to chemical released by the process or work activities, while Form B1 tracks the 20 primary ingredients we extensionally pour and mix. Form B2 is a safety check designed to capture secondary hazard. It's look for any dangerous chemical byproducts, toxic fume, gases, or vapors generated as a direct result of the lab reactions or heating procedures themselves. As you can see clearly from our table on this slide, the total number of hazardous process release recorded is 0. All entries are marked as none or not classified. This confirms that our standard laboratory tasks, such as biological media preparation and basic food testing protocols, are chemically stable and do not generate any hidden or secondary chemical emissions beyond the original reagents we already accounted for.
Next, I will present the inhalation exposure assessment, which is shown in Form C. This assessment evaluates the livelihood of workers inhaling hazardous chemical during laboratory preparation activities. We consider factors such as the degree of chemical release, the worker's exposure, and the permissible exposure limit or PEL for each chemical. For the result, most chemicals show low inhalation risk because they have a low degree of release and exposure. However, two chemicals require greater attention, namely potassium dichromate and methanol. Both have a moderate degree of release and moderate inhalation exposure, resulting in higher risk rating compared to the other chemical. Methanol required the highest inhalation risk rating of 20, while potassium dichromate required a risk rating of 16. These findings indicate that these chemicals should always be handled inside a functioning fume hood while workers wear appropriate personal protective equipment. This slide shows the remaining chemicals in the inhalation assessment. Most chemicals have low inhalation risk. However, citric acid has a risk rating of 12 because it can cause respiratory irritation, while DBPH has a moderate risk rating of 6. Overall, good ventilation, proper use of fume hoods, and PPE are important to minimize inhalation exposure. Next, we move to Form C2. In this slide, presents the dermal exposure assessment, which evaluates the risk of chemicals contacting the skin. Most chemicals have low dermal risk. However, methanol and citric acid show high risk because they can be absorbed through the skin or cause irritation. For Linschow-Pelters phenol reagents also has a moderate risk due to its corrosive properties. Therefore, workers should always wear gloves and lab coat when handling these chemicals. This slide shows the remaining dermal assessment results. 3,5-dinitro-salicylic acid has a high dermal risk because it is corrosive. Chemicals like methyl red solution, potato dextrose, and DBPH have moderate risk, while the others are generally low risk. Overall, proper PPE and good laboratory practice are essential to prevent skin exposure to hazardous chemicals.
Next, I will present Form D1, which focuses on the technical control measures currently available in the Food Instrumentation Laboratory. Overall, the lab already has several engineering controls in place, such as 2 chemical fume hoods, general ventilation, eye wash facilities, safety shower, fire extinguisher, and appropriate personal protective equipment (PPE). These existing controls help to reduce workers' exposure to hazardous chemicals during routine laboratory activities. However, our assessment found that some improvements are still needed. One of the main issues is that both fume hoods are fully occupied during laboratory operations, which limits their availability whenever volatile or highly hazardous chemical needs to be handled. Therefore, we recommend ensuring that all high-risk chemical handling, especially chemicals such as methanol and potassium dichromate, is always carried out inside a functioning fume hood. The fume hood should also be inspected and maintained regularly to ensure they continue operating effectively. Besides that, appropriate PPE such as lab coat, chemical-resistant gloves, safety goggles, and suitable respiratory protection should always be used according to hazards of each chemical. Proper chemical storage, including the use of a dedicated chemical storage cabinet, should also be implemented to further reduce exposure risk. So this improvement will strengthen the existing engineering control and provide better protection for laboratory personnel. Moving on to Form D2, this section evaluates the organizational or administrative control measures implemented in the laboratory. From our assessment, several organizational controls were found to be inadequate. For example, there are no formal standard operating procedure or SOPs specifically for chemical handling and spill response. In addition, the laboratory assistant has not received specific chemical handling or safety training, and there is no dedicated chemical storage cabinet available. To address these gaps, we recommend developing and implementing comprehensive SOPs for chemical handling, spill management, waste disposal, and emergency response. These SOPs should be reviewed regularly, preferably every 5 years or whenever there are significant changes in work processes. We also recommend providing regular chemical safety training and refresher courses for all laboratory personnel. This will improve workers' knowledge of safe work practice, correct PPE usage, emergency procedure, and proper handling of hazardous chemicals. Finally, routine workplace inspections, proper documentation, and periodic safety audits should be carried out to ensure that all safety procedures continue to be followed consistently. By strengthening this organizational control, the laboratory can improve compliance with CHRA requirements while providing a safer and healthier working environment for all laboratory personnel. So, to conclude, although the laboratory already has several existing control measures, implementing this recommended technical and organizational improvement will further minimize chemical exposure and enhance the overall effectiveness of the laboratory's chemical safety management.
This slide presents Form D3, which evaluate the emergency response preparedness in the Food Instrumental Laboratory. During the assessment, several emergency facilities was inspected to determine whether they were available, functional, and adequate for emergency situation. Overall, most of the emergency preparedness measures were found to be adequate. As you can see, the laboratory is equipped with emergency response plan, fire extinguisher, IWAS station, and emergency safety shower. However, one issue was identified, which is the laboratory has two emergency exit doors, but only one exit door is functioning. This was considered inadequate because both emergency exit doors should be accessible during the emergency situation. Therefore, the recommendation is to provide a key or repair the second exit door so that both emergency exit doors remain functional. In addition, routine inspection and maintenance are recommended for all emergency facilities, such as servicing the fire extinguisher, checking the emergency shower, and make sure contact information remain clearly visible. And this slide shows Form D4, which summarizes the recommendation for exposure monitoring and medical surveillance. Based on overall finding of the chemical health risk assessment, there is no necessity to conduct chemical exposure monitoring because the current level of chemical exposure does not require routine monitoring. Similarly, medical surveillance is also not required as the assessment did not identify significant exposure that would justify a medical surveillance program. However, this recommendation should be reviewed whenever there are changes in chemical use, work process, or if chemical develop symptoms related to chemical exposure. And lastly, this slide shows Form D5, which outlines the required action for chemical with higher health risk. In this assessment, potassium dichromate was identified as hazardous chemical because it is classified as carcinogen category 1B and skin sensitizer category 1. The first recommendation is to substitute it with a less hazardous chemical whenever possible. If the substitution is not possible, all handling and weighing activity should be carried out inside a chemical fume hood to reduce inhalation exposure. In addition, the chemical should be stored in a designated area with appropriate warning label.
Let's start with the tactical control. These are tangible, physical measures we implement to minimize the exposure to hazardous chemicals. This section is further broken down into 3 critical areas, which is first, we have engineering controls. The prime example highlight here is our fume hoods. We must continue to strictly ensure that all chemical fume hoods are fully operational and used correctly. This is our primary line of defense, physically containing and venting hazardous vapors away from the user. Next is isolation and storage. Effective control isn't just about how we use the chemical, it's also about how we store them. Chemicals should be stored appropriately, strictly following their specific isolation requirement. This can prevent accidental mixing of incompatible substances and reduce the risk of spill. Finally, within the technical controls, we have personal protective equipment, or we call it as PPE. This is our last line of defense. The diagram reminds us that appropriate PPE, including the laboratory coats, military gloves, and safety goggles, must always be worn when handling chemicals, and that this equipment must be selected based on the specific chemical hazard. Now, let's move to the second pillar, which is organizational control. These controls relate to the human elements, our policies, procedures, and knowledge sharing, which ensure that our technical controls are effective. We focus on the three main areas here. First, documented and safety training is essential. Everyone must undergo specialized training in chemical management. This isn't just one-time event, it's an ongoing process to ensure proficiency and to reinforce best practice. This training must be documented to maintain compliance and a clear record of our capability. Second, the availability of SOPs and SDS. Standard Operating Procedures SOP and Safety Datasheet SDS must be immediately accessible to everyone. SOPs tell us exactly how to perform a task safely, while SDS provide crucial information about the specific hazard, handling instruction, and the emergency response for our every chemical in use. Immediate access means this information is available right when and where it's needed, not locked away in an office. Third, and finally, are our hygiene procedures. This is a critical everyday practice that prevents accidental ingestion or cross-contamination. This includes policies like no food or drink in lab areas, regular hand washing, and procedures for decontamination. Hygiene procedures are simple yet powerful control that depends on everyone's diligent participation.
Next is the emergency response plan. The first recommendation is to conduct readiness drills regularly. These drills prepare workers to respond quickly and correctly during chemical spills, leaks, or accidental exposures. Secondly, all emergency equipment should be checked every week. This includes eye wash stations, safety showers, fire extinguishers, spill kits, and first aid equipment. Regular inspections ensure that all emergency equipment is functioning properly and ready to be used whenever an emergency occurs. Having a good emergency response plan can reduce injuries, minimize chemical exposure, and improve the overall safety of the laboratory. To ensure workers' safety, exposure monitoring and medical surveillance should also be implemented. First is air monitoring. Air monitoring is carried out to measure the concentration of airborne chemical contaminants in the laboratory. This helps determine whether workers are exposed to hazardous levels of chemicals and whether the existing ventilation system is effective. Secondly, targeted medical surveillance should be provided for workers who are regularly exposed to hazardous chemicals. Regular medical examinations help detect any early signs of chemical-related health problems before they become more serious. And now I will explain the specific actions that should be taken to improve safety in the laboratory. First, when handling powder chemicals, proper dust control should be used to reduce dust in the air. Second, we should replace hazardous chemicals with safer alternatives whenever possible. Third, when working with volatile or irritating chemicals, workers should always use the local exhaust ventilation to remove harmful vapors.
As you can see on this slide, there are few pictures that show the condition of emergency safety equipment on this laboratory.